Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great honor to introduce to you our next guest speaker. He joined the faculty of the Art History program in the University of Massachusetts in Amherst in 1970. His primary field of teaching and research is the art and architecture of the Islamic world, in particular, the artistic traditions of the Ottoman Turks, Islamic carpets and textiles, Islamic imagery in European art, and issues of economics and patronage in Islamic art. His recent publications are numerous. I'll mention just a few. Gardens of Paradise, Ottoman Turkish tiles of the 15th, 17th centuries, masterpieces of Anatolian carpets from the Museum of Turkish and Islamic Arts, and his latest publication, Iznik, The Artistry of Ottoman Ceramics. His chapter on Islamic art in the 7th edition of Janssen's History of Art appeared in early 2006. Current projects include catalogs for 2 major collections of Islamic art and a number of articles on Ottoman art on Orientalism. He is also in the midst of digitizing 20,000 of his 140,000 color slides with ArtStore, a project of the Mellon Foundation. Professor Denny has served as a trustee of the Textile Museum in Washington and was for 3 decades honorary curator of carpets and textiles at the Harvard University Art Museums in Cambridge. He is a member of the Board of Governors of the Institute of Turkish Studies and serves as Charles Grant Ellis Research Fellow on Oriental Carpets at the Textile Museum. He is also now Senior Consultant to the Department of Islamic Art at the Metropolitan Museum, where he is involved in the planning of their new Islamic galleries. He is active as a lecturer and as a consultant to museums and other institutions in the United States and abroad. In his speech today, Professor Denny will offer us an interesting approach to the influence of the element of water on the art and architecture of the Ottoman Empire. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Walter Denny. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Well, I'm the last one to say this, but I also say it from the heart. Many thanks to Jonathan and Sheila for this fabulous symposium, and to VCUQ for having us all here. I'm in an unenviable position of being the last speaker at a program which up to now has featured wonderful talks. So the pressure is on me to at least try to live up to the excellent standard that's been established. I also have the challenge of staying within 45 minutes, being a college professor used to the 50-minute hour, but I'll do my best to do that as well. I'll mention one thing at the outset, and that is that all the images you're going to see today, for those of you who are taking pictures of the images on your cameras, will be available along with a great number of excellent images from Jonathan and Sheila's archive on the ArtStore service in a very short time. They're now going on very rapidly, and for institutions that have membership in ArtStore, the pictures you're going to see today from me, all of which are my own photographs with one exception, will be on the ArtStore service. Now, the Ottoman Empire is in a different position from most of the societies we've dealt with up to this time in the symposium. With the notable exception, I suppose, on one level, of India with its abundant rainfall. The fact is that the Ottoman Empire and its traditional core lands in Anatolia, but also in its extensive European possessions, has been blessed with a great deal of water. It has an extensive shoreline on the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the Marmara Sea, the Aegean. It has lots and lots of rivers, and over a large part of the Ottoman Empire in its heyday, there was a great deal of rain, the exceptions being, of course, its North African possessions and the areas of Iraq and Syria. And it had 3 capital cities over its ascendancy, and these 3 capital cities were all blessed with water in different ways. The first capital of Bursa was a mountainside capital in which snow-capped mountains fed an abundance of both hot and cold underground springs. Its second capital was Edirne, where today the Maritsa and Tunja rivers flow together at the border where Bulgaria, Turkey, and Greece all meet. So it was a river city. And their third and ultimate capital was Istanbul, at the confluence of the White Sea and the Black Sea on the Bosporus, a city which is famous for being on the water. Now, from earliest times, the Ottoman Empire, since it arose in the northwest corner of Anatolia, a seismically very active area with large numbers of mountains, it has been blessed with hot springs. And so we see among the very earliest Ottoman buildings a large number of baths of a kind that you don't traditionally find in the Islamic or Roman worlds. That is to say, baths which, unlike the hammam, where there had to be a room in which to heat the hot water for the bath, the water flowed very hot, naturally out of the ground. This type of architecture, which was borrowed from Byzantine and Roman traditions that pre-existed in this area, led to the kinds of buildings we call kaplıca. I will parenthetically note here, for those of you who know Turkey very well, that I started taking photographs in Turkey almost 50 years ago, and as a matter of principle, if I have an older and a newer photograph of something, I will always use the older photograph, showing you something you might not be able to see today. Now, the idea of water as being associated with holiness is something that exists in this part of the world, the Ottoman core lands, long before the advent of Islam. In Byzantine times, what were called ayazma, or sacred springs, were the same springs that were used by the Ottomans in later times, had associations with sanctity of all sorts, and many of them were said to be especially blessed by saints of one sort or another. Therefore, the entire Islamic conception of water as something holy and special is something that exists in the Middle East, actually before the advent of Islam, as part of the broader civilization that begins with Abraham and its descendants. Now, in getting about in the Ottoman Empire, because especially their European possessions, but also their Asian possessions, were possessions where there were many large rivers. One might say that the first and indeed most essential form of water architecture developed by the Ottomans was that of building bridges. Since they inherited a great bridge building tradition from the Seljuks, who it could be argued in turn were the ultimate benefactors of a Roman building tradition, these massive over-engineered Ottoman bridges that one finds throughout the Ottoman Empire served not only to establish the Ottoman post roads in the Roman tradition, but also, of course, provided the highways down which the Ottoman armies marched into Europe and into Asia on their journeys of conquest. So our first and most important and earliest, and in some ways most emblematic form of Ottoman water architecture is the bridge, whether it's Sinan's famous bridge at Kaplıca near Istanbul, or whether it is perhaps the most emblematic of all Ottoman bridges, the bridge at Mostar in Bosnia, recently restored after its tragic destruction in the recent war. The Ottomans also, just parenthetically, were also great builders. They were also great builders of pontoon bridges, and we can see in this detail from an Ottoman miniature of chronicling the conquests of Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century. We can easily see that they were very good at floating bridges as well, an essential part, of course, of military technology in our own time. Now, given the enormous ecological differences between various parts of the Ottoman Empire, from very dry to very wet, from very high in elevation to very low, from rich agricultural lands to large amounts of barren or semi-barren unarable lands, there are many different solutions to water resource problems. Unlike Iran, where the qanat, or underground canal, dug by highly skilled workers under conditions of unspeakable physical difficulty and danger, prevailed, the rocky soil of Anatolia does not allow for that kind of engineering. As a result, we have very few qanat, these underground channels. In the Ottoman Empire, most water was conveyed above ground. Below-ground water is accessed by traditional Middle Eastern means that you can find anywhere in the Middle Eastern world, such as what we'd call a shaduf in certain parts of the world, wells in the desert that yield a meager offering of brackish water. Today, in the what's known as the GAP project, the Guinea-Anadolu Project, one of the largest hydraulic projects ever undertaken by any country in any time and place, which oddly enough goes almost unnoticed in Turkey, its own country. The southeastern part of Turkey is undergoing a massive amount of economic and agricultural development as a result of building of huge dams on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, both of which, as you know, originate today in the Republic of Turkey. There is, as I said, an enormous range of environments from the rainy Black Sea coast to Basra and the Hijaz within the Ottoman Empire at its height that leads to many, many different kinds of water management in many different places. Now, today I'm going to confine my discussion largely to the Ottoman capital city of Istanbul. And the best map of Istanbul is still the map engraved by Mr. Thomas Bartlett for Miss Pardo's Beauties of the Bosporus, published in the mid-19th century, which you see on the left-hand side. Istanbul, previously Constantinople, was, of course, a city that had a Roman and Byzantine legacy. And although it is itself situated on a triangle of land with water, a river estuary on the north side, the Sea of Marmara on the south side, and the Bosporus, the 17-mile-long strait linking the Black Sea and the Marmara Sea in front of it, Istanbul's water supply had, since early times, in early Roman times, been derived from a watershed in an area known as the Belgrade Forest in the hills, some distance away outside of the town, 25 kilometers outside of the town, and brought into the city via a system of gravity-fed aqueducts. The Ottomans in Istanbul were very fortunate in that their entire water supply was gravity-fed. They did not have to worry about the transporting of water from a river on the backs of animals, nor did they have to worry about powering a water wheel or I've forgotten what the the interesting term that was used of little buckets on a belt. At any rate, they didn't have to deal with this very, very interesting and ingenious type of device, because the water all was brought to them by the force of gravity, which, at least up to this point, shows no signs of giving out and in need of replenishment. And once it reached the city, it was stored in enormous cisterns, the largest of which were created under the reign of the Emperor Justinian in Byzantine times, the most famous of which is the so-called Sunken Palace cistern, or Yerebatan Saray in Istanbul, which you see on the left. And the Ottomans also built all over the city other above-ground cisterns in which they could store this aqueduct-brought water, and from which it was then distributed by a very Roman system of pipes to the local neighborhoods where it was consumed. Now, the earliest investment in water infrastructure in Istanbul had one primary goal, and that was repopulation of the city. In 1453, at the time of the Ottoman conquest, the city had reached a low in population of approximately 50,000 people. And in order to bring people back into the city, they had to have water in their neighborhoods. Therefore, the continuing impetus for about 150 years after the conquest of Constantinople in 1453 was on the building of fountains and conduits and aqueducts and pipes and other kinds of things that would allow people to repopulate the city. Over history, Istanbul's water supply has been affected by three variables, two of which are completely beyond human control, and the other one of which is partially beyond human control. And these are earthquakes, fire, because Istanbul was, until the 20th century, largely a city of wooden houses, and the third is what we could call the Waqf economy, the economy that supported the pious foundations whose income led to the upkeep and the preservation and the staffing of the infrastructure that distributed water. Now, all of these are extremely turbulent and unpredictable. No one knows when an earthquake is going to strike, or today we do, but we don't, of course. We can predict it to within about 50 years, which is like not being able to predict it at all. And we also today, and fire, of course, the outbreak of fire was very, very unpredictable. And due to the way that Istanbul's neighborhoods were structured, not only unpredictable, when a fire did occur, they basically had to burn themselves out because the fire department was simply not up to the task. And then the third one, even more unpredictable in some ways, was the Waqf economy. Let me just briefly give you one example. The enormous flow of silver and gold from Mexico and Peru into Europe in the 16th century led by 1585 to a devaluation of gold and silver's value throughout Europe. There was too much of it, it lost its value. In an economy where everything is very rigidly created on the assumption that prices will remain the same and never rise. And this was the case in many, many pious foundations. In the latter part of the 16th century, the salaries paid to people who were paid by Waqf and the amounts of money that were available for what the Turks call Waqf, being unable to pronounce a W sound, these resources suddenly lost all of their value and led to all kinds of problems in the realm of art and architecture, but especially in anything that was supported by fixed rents coming from properties that were part of an endowment. Now, another interesting, in the case of the pictures here, we see in almost every major Ottoman foundation some evidence of water management, whether it is a fountain, whether it is simply, as in the case of this peculiar-looking tower on the left-hand side here, a water tower, a so-called a siphon structure, which is designed to keep up a steady amount of water pressure that won't rise so high as to burst the pipes and won't go so low as to cause the pipes to run dry or get air in them. And the ultimate goal of all of this, of course, is to bring water to neighborhoods where people who do not have water laid on in their house can bring the water home to use for cooking, for bathing, for watering plants, for whatever they need it for. Water distribution in Turkey follows all kinds of complex. Am I ahead of myself here? I think maybe not. No. Let's start here. Let's sort of backtrack here. I'd like to take a look for just a second here at a little bit of historical background. Now, the Turks, who today, 14 million of them live in one enormous urban complex in Istanbul, started out, that is the Turks themselves before intermarrying, started out as tribal groups from Central Asia with a history of pastoral nomadism. And that is a kind of existence that involves living in temporary housing, tents, or the buildings constructed of lattice and felt that we call, in the English language, yurts. That is to say these domical portable dwellings. And there's a constant search for two things: forage, that is things that your sheep and your goats can eat, and for water. And therefore, when they did settle, they either settled in oases. The classical example would be Merv in Turkmenistan today, or they migrated. And there is speculation that the western migrations of Turks that began as early as the time they started garrisoning settlements like Samarra in Iraq in the 9th century may have been, to some great extent, simply forced on them as a result of lack of water in their homeland that caused a migration toward the west. And we can see the preservation of this nomadic interest in water, in such vessels as the matara, which Linda showed you, which becomes not only, I mean, this is a pretty fancy canteen. Those of us who participated in this conference got a wonderful Lexon water bottle with Muhammad Zakaria's logo of the conference on it, but this is, and this thing up here is almost as nice as the ones we got, although it is a great deal heavier and a lot harder to carry in one's backpack. And as Linda pointed out to you, it becomes an actual symbol of the imperium. That is, the Sultan is followed by 2 or 3 high court officials, one of whom carries his sword, a symbol of his power as the leader, as the Amir al-Mu'minin, the leader of all the Muslims, and his bow and arrow, which is a distinctively more Turkish form, the short bow, the compound bow and arrow, a more Turkish form of weapon, and the water canteen, which probably evokes the original nomadic origins, which is why so many Turkish sultans received guests also in tents and not, as you see here in this particular miniature painting, in masonry buildings. So the survival of nomadic custom is really something that I think we don't think enough about. I didn't notice it until my best friend in Turkey invited me to join him for a weekend on the beach many, many years ago in a tent. And I realized that my dear friend Yüksel was an entirely different person in a tent than he was in a brick apartment house. And I began to muse upon the fact that maybe this had something to do with going back to one's cultural roots. You can see it very graphically here. Both of these objects are copies of an animal skin, a goat skin. A goat skin was cut, once the goat had been removed from the skin, the 2 legs, I'm sorry, but that's the way it works. And the 2 legs became the spouts out of which you would drink water, and it was sewn up along the other end. And I'm not showing you a goat skin because I don't have a photograph of one, but I have a photograph of a bronze goat skin over here, which is just your average, everyday, middle-class goat skin, permanent goat skin. And then on the other side over here, a rock crystal goat skin inlaid with vast numbers of emeralds and rubies, which just goes to show that when you have plenty of money, you can do just about anything you want, including having a rock crystal goat skin. So this is part of the survival then of nomadic custom. And I think we always have to keep this in mind as we examine what kinds of things the Turks do. And then there's a broader culture. Since the water distribution in the Ottoman Empire follows the pattern of other Islamic lands, but only in an expanded way, we also see water as an urban phenomenon. And water in the city is sometimes made available by vendors who carry on their backs a very distinctively, well, it's not completely Ottoman, but sort of distinctively Ottoman form of brass vessel, together with a cup holder made out of brass on the front. And this is an urban tradition. A water cellar in Morocco looks a little different than a Turkish water cellar, and a water cellar in Cairo in the old days, if we look at our Orientalist paintings, looks indeed a little bit different from the Turkish one as well. But as an urban phenomenon, water makes its way into middle-class living in such vessels as the one Linda already showed us, that is to say the classical ewer or ibrik used, among other things, for the washing of one's hands between different courses of an Islamic meal. And there is also a further conflation and confusion in Ottoman art between water in all of its practicality as a necessity of life, and water in the image we've been looking at throughout this symposium, water as a divine gift, as a gift of God, as something that has a distinctly religious tinge to it. We can see that perhaps best in these 2 illustrations. One is a calligraphic ewer that you see on the left-hand side, and the other one in the form of the traditional Ottoman domestic ibrik. The other is the inclusion of the image of the ibrik in large numbers of village prayer rugs in Turkey. In the prayer rug, its meaning is quite obvious. This is the symbol for what the Turks would call abdest, but which elsewhere in the Islamic world is referred to as wudu. That is to say, the ablutions before prayer, but it is also a symbol of purity and, again, of God's beneficence in providing such things as water to humans. One last thing that I want to say in way of preamble here is that, of course, in any city, in any civilization, in any time, there's a special mystique for living on the water. Each one of us has a dream house somewhere in their imagination. This is mine right here. Unfortunately, I can't afford it, and someone else is living there. But I do enjoy looking at the photograph. And the fact is that in Turkey, living on the water became from very early on a sign not only of social status, but also a basic cultural value, that when you have water, you live as close to it as you possibly can. Now I want to turn to a look at the water architecture itself. The most important of all kinds of water buildings in the Ottoman Empire are probably the public baths. Now these are, in fact, the legitimate hammam. These are not kaplıca. They are baths where the water is heated by fire, where they have a hypocaust, that is, the hot gases from the fire are put underneath the floor to heat up the floor. And these baths consist of the three classical Roman parts in their Ottoman incarnation. The cold room, where one disrobes or puts on one's towel, pays one's fees, and has some refreshments and talks with one's friends, the social part of the bath. And then the second part of the bath, the so-called tepid room, where one washes oneself, and the third part of the bath, the hot room, where one sweats, the sauna, as it were. And this type of bath is a continual temptation for anybody wishing to do architectural patronage in Istanbul, both because of the hadiths of the Prophet, because of long-standing Islamic traditions of body cleanliness, and because of of course, because it serves a very, very useful social need under the principles of zakat. And as a result, this is the most splendid of the Istanbul baths. You'll see it's almost completely symmetrical. And here we have this is the women's end, this is the women's cold room, and then the washing rooms, and then the hot room, and the men on the other end of the building. This building has been turned today into a rug emporium by the Turkish government, and I hope eventually there are plans perhaps to turn it back into a bath. It was built by the wife of Suleiman the Magnificent in the very, very center of downtown Istanbul in the 15th century. So baths are the first and perhaps most important and obvious sorts of things that we think of when we think of water architecture, but I'm going to deal with them only very briefly today. We then move to fountains. Now, I think I ought to clarify that in the Turkish language, many of the terms we've already heard here in this symposium have acquired somewhat different connotations. Yasser was talking about the word şadırvan. This is my şadırvan. In Turkey, şadırvan is a term that applies exclusively to fountains that are used for wudu, for abdest, for the ritual ablutions before prayer, and therefore they are associated exclusively with mosques. The second type of fountain is called a sebil, because Turks would never put an a and an I in the same word. And the sebil is going to be pretty much the same as we saw in Agnieszka's presentation. And the third type of fountain is called a çeşme, and that is basically a wall fountain, or I prefer to call it a trough fountain. And there is a fourth kind of fountain, which I'll deal with at the very end of my presentation, called a salsabil. Salsabil is a word that occurs in the Quran. It is explained as a fountain of paradise. In the Turkish sense, a salsabil, of course not salsabil, but salsabil, is a playing fountain, an ornamental fountain that squirts water into the air. In the apt words of the Arabic poet, like a column of crystal that then shatters into many small pieces. So here and şadırvans themselves, mosque fountains, are of two types. Traditionally, there is a freestanding shadrvan, generally rectangular or polygonal in shape, which one finds in the middle of the avlu, the forecourt, the sahan, as it were, of the Ottoman mosque. And these fountains are generally the most beautiful, the most extensively carved and worked, and they range from the very, very beautiful imperial kinds, such as this fountain right here in the Mosque of Selim II in Edirne from the early 1570s, to very ordinary fountains like this one in front of a neighborhood mosque in Kastamonu. These fountains, no matter how old they are, how precious they are, how beautiful they are almost all of them in Turkey in continuous daily use. It is, in some ways, a very interesting point for us to ponder that these Cairene fountains that are now being so beautifully, capably, and ably restored by such wonderful expertise are not being returned to their original uses, whereas in Turkey, both because of custom and because of long-term governmental policy from the Directorate of Pious Foundations, the Vakıflar Başmüdürlüğü in Ankara, many of these traditional buildings, as many as possible, are being returned to their original use, where prudence and practicality allow it. So we have this kind of shadrvan, the fancy kind, and then we have the plain kind, that is to say, the linear shadrvan. Basically, these are incorporated into mosque buildings themselves. In the Mosque of Suleiman the Magnificent, they're found right outside the main part of the building. They're right inside of the mosque itself. There are within the walls of the mosque, just like there were in Didi Ruggles showing us that marvelous slide of the wall of the Mosque of Cordoba with the pipe right inside of it. And they allow large numbers of people to perform their ablutions at the same time. In the Mosque of Sultan Ahmed, they are found instead along the lower part of the avlu, the san, the forecourt instead. This is the best I could get to have a human being here, this half a human being disappearing in there at obviously a very sparsely attended midwinter prayer with no leaves on the trees. So there's a long tradition of both of these. In particular reference to the Mosque of Suleiman the Magnificent, during Didi's talk this morning, I recalled a book by a marvelous study by a Turkish scholar named Kazim Çeçen called Süleymaniye Suyoları, which discusses the fact that in the building of the Mosque of Suleiman the Magnificent, a large part of the expense went into something that most of us never even think about when we think of that building, and that is the assurance of a copious supply of gravity-fed water to feed these linear shadrvans, which on a Friday prayer day might serve 8,000 to 10,000 people, all of whom wanted to wash at the very same time. Another kind of fountain that we find in mosques in the early Ottoman Empire, which disappears later on, is the interior fountain. Now, it must be said that because of for climatic reasons, Turkish mosques do not follow either the Iranian or the Arab traditional mosque, which consists largely of a rectangular courtyard with the riwaks or covered places next to it. But the vestigial open courtyard exists in Turkish mosques. In the imperial mosques of Bursa, it's the first room you go into before you get into the mosque proper by going up the steps. And this room has a dome over it, but the dome originally had an oculus or a hole in the middle of it, and directly below the hole, today plugged up because pigeons like to come into mosques as well, there was a fountain with a playing salsabil in the middle. In another Bursa mosque, the Great Mosque of Bursa, constructed around 1399, we see one of the 20 domes in the building, a central one, also has the oculus, today covered by glass, and below that, again, a pool and a playing fountain. Now, I was very interested to hear that the trees in a sahan of a mosque could be considered to be an impediment to prayer and to religious thought. When the Turkish view is, in fact, that playing water as God's ultimate great gift to mankind, the sound of playing water in a mosque enhances rather than takes away from the atmosphere of reverence that leads to prayer. Public fountains were a part of almost every mosque complex, or külliye, that was erected in the Ottoman Empire. And I show you here probably the most beautiful of all Ottoman culées, that of the Turkish Sultan Bayezid II in Edirne from the latter part of the 15th century. It includes a mosque with the sahan, and there's a shadırvan right in the middle of the sahan. There is a mental hospital right here, and the main room of the mental hospital incorporates a pool and a playing fountain because Ottoman physicians determined from early on that so-called white noise, the sound of water in a fountain, is very, very soothing to people who have mental disturbances. And so the Vakıf of the mosque provides for a copious supply of water and also pays the salaries of musicians to play traditional music all day long, because both of these things were found to have very remarkably beneficent effects on people who had mental problems. Contrast this with the Western or European enlightened attitude that people who had mental illness were possessed of the devil, and the best thing to do with them was to keep them in a foul dungeon and beat them several times a day. So the fountain, the gatehouse, outside of the actual mosque complex that serves the neighborhood on the street outside, is where one finds a fountain. In this case, the trough or cheshmeh fountain, the first one we see here. And I want to draw your attention to one thing which we've seen in all of these fountains, in all of these presentations, beginning with Marcus's on the first day in the first morning, and that is always there's an arch above the water. And I think that means something very important, but let's hold off for a minute. Now, we're now going to take a look at cheshmeh fountains, wall fountains. And they always incorporate basically three elements, or actually four, the one you don't see. There is a reservoir behind that holds water, and this is gravity fed. You don't have to pack in the water to fill it up. There is in front of that a trough. And this trough not only collects the overflow of water, but in a neighborhood cheshmeh, and neither one of these is a neighborhood cheshmeh. They're both in the Topkapı Palace in Istanbul. In the neighborhood cheshmeh, there would be a place where you could water your animal, where your horse could drink. And then there's a decorative panel with or without an inscription, most often with the inscription, which has exactly the kinds of hadith or Quranic quotations or all the things that Haweda talked about in her talk. It's the same thing in the Ottoman Empire as well. And then, of course, the tap, which can be turned on and off, which leads to the reservoir behind. Freestanding cheshmehs are found all over the place. That is, I don't call it a wall fountain, but a trough fountain, because there are many examples that are right out in the middle of a square or otherwise unattached to a building. They range from very small ones, like this one here, from the early 19th century, in what the Turkish call the ampir, that's A-M-P-I-R style. I don't know where in the world they ever got that word. And on this side over here, a more classical example from the early 18th century, one of the largest cheshmehs in Turkey, and that is the fountain of Ishak Ağa in Beykoz, up the Bosporus. Now, this same kind of typology is true of many, many different Istanbul fountains. Sometimes a fountain has an interesting story behind it. If you read the inscriptions on this early 18th century fountain, which was indeed a wall fountain, a trough in front of it, decoration, in this case sculptures of vases of flowers and trees, the heavenly garden, and poetry above, two separate inscriptions. You read that this fountain was founded by the muezzin of Mehmet the Conqueror, Bereketzadeh, in the 15th century. Evidently, it had gotten into a condition beyond repair because it was completely and utterly reincarnated in the early 18th century by a pious member of the royal family who added another set of inscriptions to it. So clearly, if a fountain were important enough, what they did back in the early 18th century was they found somebody locally, the local equivalent of Agnieszka, and they restored it. And that fountain has stayed here like this today. The smallest kind of wall fountain looks like this, and it's basically about the same size as a wall water cooler that you'd have in a university building. A very, very small basin in front of it, not suitable for a horse to drink out of, certainly, and a tap again, but the usual inscription and decoration as well. Well, there are many, many different kinds of Cheshme fountains, and I can't go into all of them here except just to tell you that there are a tremendous number. In Istanbul, among old fountains, there are well over 300 in the catalog of older monuments. Many of these, we must assume, replaced earlier ones that disappeared. It's interesting that of the surviving fountains in Istanbul, 2 are from the 15th century, only 2. And yet we know that the late 15th century was the largest population expansion of the city in Muslim neighborhoods. 45 from the 16th century, and 168 from the 18th century. 51 from the 17th and 168 from the 18th century. Very, very interesting. Of those in the 18th century, 109 were built before the great earthquake of 1750, roughly 1750, and only 59 were built after the earthquake. I can't figure that out. Now let's move ahead to take a look at the next type of fountain. I really enjoy seeing pictures of fountains with people in front of them wearing red. I've often thought of renting a little boy in a red coat to take with me, but this one just walked through the picture at just the right time. These are the sebils that we learned about this morning. The Turkish sebil tends to be cylindrical or polygonal, and it has grills that may either be of metal, of bronze, as you see on the left, or of carved of marble, as you see on the right. And it has a traditional umbrella dome roof, or you could call it a hat roof with a dome, and then something that serves as an awning against the sun and also protects you from the rain. These fountains are found all over Istanbul. They require a much larger endowment than a cheshme, because they are staffed by people. They have a door so someone can get inside. And many of these fountains today have returned to their original uses, except instead of getting free water, you pay for a Coca-Cola instead. Sebils are of many different types. Sometimes this one here incorporates the grave of its founder and his family right next door. They tend to be, I've become very conscious of this since Marcus's talk, they tend to be found on main streets in Istanbul because most of the main streets are where the water mains run underneath the pavement. And so they're close to the water supply. One of the first things I'm going to do when I get back to Amherst is get myself a good map of Istanbul and start putting little red dots on it, just like Marcus's, so I can see something about the way that these things were arranged. The Turkish sebil tradition was sufficiently strong that, as Agnieszka noted in her wonderful paper this morning, it had a very great impact not only in Cairo, but indeed throughout the Ottoman Empire. And there are Ottoman sebils as well in the Balkans, although some of the best ones, which had existed for many, many centuries, disappeared in the tragedies of Bosnia in the early part of the 1990s. There are nowhere near as many sebils in Istanbul as there are cheshmes, again because of the larger amount of money, I suppose, for the endowment, and many of them are in fact part of mosque complexes. From the 15th century, we have one left over, and it's basically a window sebil, a flat window with, just like the ones in Cairo, a cheshme on either side. From the 16th century, we have 24. From the 17th, 33. And from the 18th century, we also have 33. But only one was built in the second half of the century. And from the 19th century, we have a further 30. We're very lucky to have all of this information thanks to a book written by a man named İzzet Kumbaracalar in 1938 that listed all the Istanbul sebils, and then a more recent publication in 1995 by Ömer Faruk Şerifoğlu, in which all the sebils are listed in chronological order. When you get such a large number of monuments, all of which serve the same function, a marvelous opportunity comes. And that is the opportunity to put these things in a database and subject them to statistical analysis. We could learn a lot about Ottoman Turkish, we could learn a great deal about Ottoman Turkish economy from examining these dates of foundation and the natures of them. Now I want to finish by showing you the three most beautiful and largest and most famous of all the Istanbul fountains. The fountain of Mahmut I at Tophane is 4 cheshmes, the cheshme right here, combined in one building. Its projecting roof and dome providing the shade. It's made out of marble, and it is completely covered in sculptures, all of which are of paradisiacal imagery, that is to say, vases of flowers, cypress trees. The texts are poetic texts which either evoke the believer's duty to provide water as a part of one's social functions, or Quranic inscriptions, again, and Hadith inscriptions of the same sort that we have dealt with. This was built in 1732. And its flower reliefs are really quite interesting, as they show a considerable amount of botanical accuracy in the blossoms they show, something we tend to think only belongs in Mughal India, but in fact the Turks did it too. The second of the Istanbul's 3 great fountains is known as the Sebil of Saliha Sultan. It was built also in 1732, and it's in the Azapkapı neighborhood of Istanbul. This consists of 1 Sebil and 2 cheshmes, one on either side of it. This Sebil is an extremely attractive one, and it has the extremely elaborate decoration on 3 of its 5 sides, and an extremely ornamental roof, as you can see here. This one is especially interesting in the complexity of its bronze grills. You'll notice that we've dealt, the third of our famous Istanbul fountains wasn't built in 1732. It was built in 1728. The first third of the 18th century is the great age of Turkish fountains, and this is the famous fountain of Ahmet III outside of the Topkapı Gate in Istanbul. Those of you who know Istanbul well will recognize this photograph was taken in 1958 before the old houses back here were demolished and reconstructed as the Ayasofya Pansiyonları, the most interesting first example of so-called adaptive reuse of old buildings into a hotel in Turkey. This fountain has 4 cheshmes. And if you look at it, it looks like it's got 4 sebils too, except look closely at these sebils. There is a domed reservoir inside of 2 of them. 2 of them are false and just there for architectural symmetry, and only 2 of them are real. Does this mean that Ahmet didn't have enough money to endow for 4 permanent attendants, or was there some other reason? I have no idea, but I suspect that looking more closely at the time, we could come up with an answer to that. And here is one of the cheshmes on the Ahmet fountain, minus its spigot, of course. It is today one of the best known fountains in Istanbul. Its poetical texts were written by Vehbi, the court poet, the poet laureate, you might say, to Ahmet III. And then I just want to show you a few, at the end, a few of the better known salsabils in Istanbul. These, of course, have the strongest association with paradise due to their mention in the Quran. This particular example is in the 4th court of the Topkapı Palace. It also was built in the first third of the 18th century, also by Ahmet III. And there was a viewing pavilion right here, out into the pool through which you could look at the fountain. I actually have earlier pictures of it squirting, but I thought these were better. You could see it a little better by using these photographs. And here are a couple more examples. The bowl-type fountain here is actually of the early 20th century, of the classical revival period in Turkey, in the 4th courtyard of the palace, and the one on the left-hand side is in the madrasa of Sultan Bayezid. Now, what kind of principles can we derive from all this? I think, I realized all of a sudden that this data I have here can really be taken some very interesting places. Again, it was probably Marcus who gave me that idea. But originally I had intended to draw somewhat different conclusions at the end of this paper, so I'll give you my original ones instead. I've decided, especially after the last 2 days, that consciousness of the importance of water diminishes in direct proportion to its abundance and availability. The more water we have, the less we think about it, the less we care about it. I'm fond of pointing out to my students at the University of Massachusetts that the population of Amherst, Massachusetts, which when all the universities are in session is 50,000, is served by a municipal water department with 6 full-time employees. On the other hand, in the traditional Middle East, as many as 10% of the population, as much as 10% of the population, may have been involved in the supplying of water to the other 90% in societies where water was very difficult to obtain. I wonder if these young Turkish couples who walk around at this monster Salsabil, situated between the Sultan Ahmet Mosque and the Hagia Sophia near the Hippodrome in downtown Istanbul, have any real understanding of the history behind this abundance of water. Do they appreciate the fact that water in the pages of the Quran is God's greatest gift to humanity? Do they understand that they are, compared to their forebears of early generations, especially those who grew up in dusty Anatolian villages, that they are living in a virtual paradise on earth where all one has to do is turn a faucet and water comes out in abundance? The fact is that by studying the history of water, at a time when, as has been noted by other presenters, the water supply, having moved from scarcity to abundance over the centuries, is about to turn once again from abundance to scarcity, we may begin to appreciate it all the more, not only because of its providing for the necessities of our lives, but also we should appreciate it as God's ultimate gift to mankind. Thank you.